Please welcome Andy Smith from Spotify.
Yep. Perfect. Right. So, well, thanks for coming. I wasn't quite expecting such a massive turnout. Thank you so much. Yes, my name's Andy Smith, and I am a front-end web developer at Spotify. And basically, I love APIs. I think this whole kind of open data thing that's been happening is probably one of the most exciting things that's happened to me as a developer since I started developing for the web. There's my details up there. That's my personal Twitter and also my Spotify thing if you want to check out how terrible my taste in music is. APIs in general, they're very, very close to my heart. Before joining Spotify, I essentially spent all of my time smashing various APIs together and seeing what fell out. For example, I wrote a music discovery tool called SpotBot. Has anyone seen SpotBot before? This kind of varies. No? Okay, that's fine. I don't mind. So SpotBot is a music recommendation tool for Twitter. Basically, you send it a bit of text, send it a tweet saying similar to, and then the name of an artist, and it will, after a few minutes, tweet you back a link to something that you might like in Spotify. And it used 3 APIs. It used, of course, the Twitter API. It would periodically scrape Twitter, basically, checking for mentions. Pass that to Audio Scrobbler, used by Last.fm, which would pull out a recommendation, something similar, look it up in Spotify using the Spotify API, and then pass it back to Twitter. So essentially, SpotBot was just the bits in the middle. It's just the plumbing that held it together. And it actually did remarkably well. I got a lot of coverage for this. It's actually one of the reasons that I got hired by Spotify. It got covered in, I think, Read Write Web and the Next Web and some like French blogs, some Italian blogs. And for something that I basically smashed together a load of other people's hard work. That was an incredible success for me. But I've not just used APIs. Before coming to Spotify, I worked at a big e-learning company in the UK, and I developed a JavaScript API and spent a lot of time teaching people how to do it, putting together tutorial materials, putting together good documentation, traveling around, teaching people how to use it. And now at Spotify, I still use APIs extensively. I use our own APIs. I help partners use our APIs, and I also use them myself to improve the core desktop experience. So as you can see, I pretty much live and breathe APIs. So what I'd like to do today is talk to you. I've called it APIs from both sides. I'd like to give you sort of rush through explanation of APIs, what they are, why they're important, why you should produce them, why you should use them, what makes a good API, all that kind of stuff. So as a content or service provider, providing an API is basically one of the coolest things that I think you can do. The web is designed to be open. And of course, as a developer, APIs give you the power to do so much, as you saw with my example earlier. So first thing, why as an organization should you provide an API? I mean, saying it's a cool thing to do isn't really a good business argument. So let's look at Spotify API. Spotify have got 3 APIs, and they serve a different purpose. First one is the web API. It's a RESTful interface into all of our catalogs metadata. Very, very simple to use. It returns JSON or XML, and you can use it to get information about anything. That's actually the one that SpotBot used. libSpotify. This is a C library. There are various kind of wrappers available, but this is deep service integration. This is you can do pretty much anything a user can do. You can use it to stream music, you can manipulate playlists. Most of what you do at a user level, you can perform programmatically through libSpotify. And the Apps API. This one's particularly exciting. This is a JavaScript-based API for integrated desktop client interaction. It's very, very basic. It's JavaScript, HTML, CSS, and we use Chromium embedded framework within the client. So you've got access to all this cool HTML5, CSS3 stuff. There's full information on the developer website. But as I say, each of these serves a very different purpose. The web API, this was provided, I guess, for people like me. It's very good at driving engagement. So what I did was I created what I essentially call a peripheral product. This is something that it's not going to change. SpotBot is not going to change anyone's core experience of Spotify, but it does add an incredible amount of value. And it also raises the profile. As I say, this SpotBot got mentioned on various sort of online presses, in the online press. It kind of raises the profile and it increases engagement. People can do other things with the service. libSpotify came about because of a fundamental mission at Spotify. We want to provide all of the music wherever you are at any time. And libSpotify, people using libSpotify helps us achieve that. Essentially, it's business development. We are developing towards our own goals by releasing this thing out to the public and letting other people help us. And the Apps API. The Apps API is quite unique. It's used extensively by partners to bring their stuff inside Spotify. Have you seen the App Finder? Have you seen, yeah, and you've seen the various different apps that you can get in there. You have like Pitchfork, Rolling Stone. People have got apps within Spotify. So this is used extensively by those guys. Day to day, I kind of help them out. And yeah, it's bringing their content inside our product and also their branding. So this is incredibly good for product development. Our product is getting better because of what these other people are doing with our APIs. And not only that, but it's also used internally by us to develop our product. I'll talk a bit more on that later on. So APIs, they're not just for digital companies, not just for purely digital companies though. Who here has heard of Moo? Not the JavaScript effects library. There's a print company called Moo. Anyone? No? Oh, okay, yeah, sure. So basically they're a print company. You can order business cards, and I think they did greeting cards at one point. So in December 2010, Moo launched an API to their printing service. Why would a printing service want an API? Well, essentially for similar reasons to Spotify. What happened as a result of this API is people started hacking around on it, started playing with it. It was very unique in that suddenly people who were hacking around with APIs on the web could create something physical. It's entering the physical world. And that's incredibly unique and incredibly exciting. And they had all kinds of mashup. There was a Flickr integration. Someone wrote a Flickr thing to find pictures of sunsets from where they were staying. It was like a postcard generator. Wherever you were staying, it would find a sunset and produce a postcard. Like authors could use it to pull in their data from Amazon with the book cover and all the details to hand out. Gamers used it for their like gamer handles. You could print these little business cards, like pulling in all this data. And these are customers that Moo wouldn't have had otherwise. They probably wouldn't think of these ideas. And even if they did think of these ideas, they're probably not going to have the time to implement them all. So really, APIs could equal free money. They bring in users and customers. So what makes a good API? How can you create a good API? Well, obviously there are many different types of APIs. As I say, there's like REST-based APIs, there's things like libSpotify, C libraries. I'm going to talk mostly about sort of public-facing like REST-style APIs, but a lot of this will apply, throughout the chain. So number one, coverage. It'd be very, very tempting to say what makes a good API is the breadth of the integration, but that's not necessarily so. What makes a really good API is having very few, very targeted endpoints. Okay? Start small. You have to identify what it is that you offer that is particularly cool. What are people going to want to play with? And do that very, very well. Developers are very, very resourceful. They're incredibly resourceful people, and if there's something missing, they're probably going to be able to work around it. Don't get me wrong, they are going to bombard you with all sorts of requests which they think you should be providing, but essentially there are ways for them to work around it. Number 2, control. You're doing this for the community, but essentially your API should be a dictatorship. You need to stay in control of this. As I say, you will get a lot of requests to say, oh, your API doesn't do this, or oh, your API ought to do this. Stay in control, because if you implement every request, you're just going to get a horrible, horrible mess. Encourage people to be resourceful. Encourage people to work around any limitations that they find. Stay in control. Don't be afraid to say no. Of course, take suggestions. Of course, implement some of them. But just remember, you are in charge. 3, versioning. Please, please, please version your API. An unversioned API is not version 1. Okay? It doesn't work. You are going to need to change your API. You're going to need to update it. And in worst case scenario, you're going to need to remove things from it. Version it. Otherwise, you lose that kind of flexibility. Number 4, a good API will be helpful. What's the best feedback a developer can get? You as a developer, what's the best feedback you can get when you're trying to build something? How about it works? That's pretty good feedback. Even better, that was easy. That's an incredibly positive feedback for a developer when they first try and implement something, and it was easy for them to do. I mean, you're pretty much all developers. You must understand this. They feel incredibly good when they produce something that quickly and that easily. And the way that you design your API can play an enormous part in this. I've got an example. Does anyone know the Spotify web API for looking at metadata? Has anyone played with that? Yeah, a few people. Okay, you are excluded from this quiz. Let's say I want to find albums by the band ABBA. I look up the Spotify documentation and I find I need to do it like this. Okay? Now I've decided, actually, what I would really like to find are tracks by the band ABBA. That seems like something that a Spotify API should be able to do. So how do you think I would do that? How about change album to track? So let's give it a go. Eureka! It works. That was easy. I didn't have to look at any additional documentation. Once I'd introduced myself to the API, I didn't need to have any additional documentation. This is a form of guessability. And don't underestimate just how satisfying that is for a developer. I mentioned I used to go around and teach people about an API. It wasn't the Spotify one. It was the e-learning company. It was amazing how much of a positive, how encouraged people were when they were able to guess the name of the function call that they needed to use. And it kept them engaged, it kept them excited. It was fun to do. It wasn't a chore anymore. You know, it was tons of fun, and it keeps them developing on your platform. But what about when there are problems? Because there will be problems. People get it wrong, services will go down, systems will fall over. Well, 4.5, because it's still kind of part of being helpful, meaningful failures. When you fail, make it understandable. APIs are predominantly machine-to-machine, okay? You implement the service or whatever that talks through the API, you you quit the shell, you push the code, whatever, and you walk away. And you just leave it. You trust it that it's going to work. So you come back a bit later, and you suddenly see that a load of data's missing, or there's a load of errors, or something's broken. So you have a look, and you see that one of the API calls is failing. So you invoke the API call manually to see what's up, and it works fine. It works absolutely fine. Well, that doesn't help. That doesn't help you fix it. You have no idea what was going wrong for that period of time, and you have no idea what a terrible experience your users must have been getting during that period when it wasn't working for who knows what reason. So a good API is going to help you work around these. So, for example, REST. REST has something pretty much built in. Let HTTP help. It's not difficult to do. Implement these HTTP status codes on callback. For example, 404 not found. You made a mess of typing the endpoint, or it's concatenated a string wrong somewhere in the code. 401 unauthorized. Please try again. Check provide if you need an API key to run this. This is all useful stuff. 429 too many requests. Slow down. You're hammering the server. Back off. These are baked right into HTTP. And of course, not all APIs are going to be HTTP based, but that doesn't mean you can't use these kind of response codes. Format your response with a header section. It's not difficult. A header section, and you can add these codes in. These are so helpful, but you'd be amazed how many times they're just not implemented. I've used many APIs over the years, and a lot of them just don't help you at all. If it fails, oh, it fails. I don't know. Empty response. HTTP 200, empty response. So whilst we're adding stuff to a header section, help the humanoids. This is something else. This is even rarer. We will get one of these status codes. It will be a custom status code because it's some kind of extremely niche error that's happened, and it returns and it says it's an error code 1210. So I have to reach for the documentation to find out what on earth a 1210 is. Seeing as we're adding this custom information in there, why not just add a sentence to tell the person why this has failed? Okay, be as helpful as possible. This is part of documentation. Documentation isn't constrained to websites, PDFs. Make it contextual by adding it right in. You'll give the developers a much more positive experience, and they will love you for it. And finally, this should probably go without saying, be responsive and be reliable, okay? If they find that these errors are occurring too often, they can't recover from them for whatever reason, or they don't know why it's down, or it's taking too long, they ain't gonna stick around. So make sure you've got the infrastructure to back this up, okay? I mean, essentially, they're bringing users into your service. And you should treat it as such. You should treat it like your conversion page. You should treat it like your checkout page. You should be analyzing these logs. You should be logging the requests, logging failures, monitoring the uptime of it. These are incredibly, incredibly important. So much of what I've talked about is what makes a good API for the end user. So we spent a lot of time making the API wonderful for the end user. Here's an idea. Why don't you eat your own dog food? This is something that we do. I know it's actually something that the SoundCloud does with their wonderful new website. So internally, we have the apps API. The apps API, as I said, is used by partners. We've got here's the Rolling Stone app, and the apps API, as I said, this is the one that's a JavaScript-based API that you just used HTML, CSS, build this amazing experience. They control entirely what is in here, and using the APIs, they can influence what happens here. Okay, they can alter playback, they can muck around with playlists. Well, largely, a lot of what we actually do internally at Spotify, the way we develop the desktop client at Spotify, is doing exactly the same thing. Here's our radio, okay? So we have basically full control. We change what this area looks like, and we influence these areas here. So we use the apps API. It's exactly the same. The stuff I do day to day to build stuff into the Spotify desktop client is entirely done with the exact same APIs that we hand out to partners. And this also helps us with rapid prototyping. We do a lot of rapid prototyping. There's no compiling. We can send updates out without people having to re-download an entire new binary. We can do it incredibly quickly. And we've also lowered the bar. I mean, I'm creating a desktop experience, and I don't know a line of C. Well, I probably know one line of C, but I wouldn't know where to start with this. So we've lowered the bar, and as a result, we've got a lot more people working on it. We can be a lot more flexible and work a lot faster. So there are actually a few reasons. Those are a few reasons why it's good for us. Why your dog food tastes good. One, your API will improve. If you're using this day to day, then you're going to notice when things aren't quite right, or you're going to notice key things that are missing. So it's going to improve. 2, your code structure will improve. By using these very specific calls, you get rid of a lot of proprietary mess that is otherwise very tempting when you've got a direct interface into whatever backend service you have. 3, I mentioned, easier onboarding for new recruits. I say I got a job at Spotify based a lot on all the stuff that I'd done before I joined. And I was using those APIs. Well, we've got the same APIs. That's my day-to-day job. I essentially trained myself before I joined the company. And also interesting, unit tests and single points of failure. If we're just using this one set of APIs, well, if something's going wrong, it doesn't matter who invoked it. We've got these single points of failure, and we can test them very, very effectively because we've spent the time to split the core functionality of our product into these very well-defined endpoints. Makes unit testing a whole lot easier. So what makes a successful API? Let's say we've built this API, and it's good. It's so good, in fact, you're doing it, you're using it yourself for everything you do. Does that mean it's successful? What can we do to measure the success of our APIs? Is it tons of signups? Say you need an API key or whatever to use this thing, and you've handed out zillions of them. Is that a successful API? Not really. As I say, I barely know a line of C. I've got myself a libSpotify API key because I had this mad idea that I was going to learn C just to build these apps. And to be honest, I haven't got around to it. So how about being used? Actually being used. Maybe this is a good metric because it's far more accurate than just how many people have signed up. But maybe what is being produced, maybe there's one huge application that someone's produced that's doing 50,000 calls to your API every day. That's going to bump your numbers up. But maybe the reason it does 50,000 calls to your API every day is because it's just written really, really badly. Maybe this is a harsh example. Let's say you're in charge of the iPhone APIs, and you look on the App Store and you see that there are 500,000 apps available for download. They're being downloaded 12 million times a month, whatever. That sounds pretty good. That sounds like your API is pretty successful. What if 90% of those are fart apps? Okay? Unless your API was basically a fart API, then that's not a good metric. That's not a good success metric for an API that's designed to integrate with some of the most advanced consumer technology available. I'm sorry to say there is no magic metric. There's no one thing where you just say, I've got an API, let's measure it. It basically depends on your intent, why you produce this in the first place. As with most metrics, you have to establish why you implement something before you can measure the success. Unless you're big into this open data thing and you just produce it to be awesome, in which case, success, you are awesome. So let's go back to Spotify. Let's go back and look at the success metrics for these APIs, because this is ultimately, if you want to build these things, this is how you get buy-in. It sounds terribly kind of businessy, but this is how you get buy-in to create these cool things. So the web API is to drive engagement through through this peripheral products, this idea of stuff that sort of sits alongside. Now we've actually had to set up a whole section of the website dedicated to keeping track of these things because there are so many of them. I'm pleased to say I'm in there about 3 times. But there are so many. We've even subcategorized them in. Sorry, you can't read that very well. But there are tons and tons of things that have been produced doing all sorts of different things. They're not all music recommendation tool. There's cataloging involved, and that's pretty successful. But more than that, I don't know if has anyone seen the website Share My Playlists? You probably guessed what it is. You share your playlists with it. And this is a business. This is an actual business that somebody has produced surrounding our APIs. That's pretty successful that somebody is that committed and that engaged that they produce something like this. So libSpotify, the C library, the thing with the wrappers that you can play music through. This was to help us to put music everywhere. Our core mission of getting music wherever you are, and that's gone pretty well too. It's most of the things on the market that say they have Spotify built in. It's going to be using libSpotify. We've got TVs, we've got boxes, we've got various brands of audio receivers, Logitech. These have all used libSpotify. This is stuff, you know, we'd love to be on these things, but we don't necessarily have the time ourselves. By producing this API, they're able to take this on and help us with our product. And finally, the Apps API. Two things with this, two things we can measure. Integrate the external partner data, bringing more content into our service, making our user experience better with other people's content, and also increasing the speed of our internal product development. Well, we've got 85, we're working with 85 partners at the moment. I think, is it a year now? I think we're coming up to a year of this thing being officially launched. 85. That's quite a lot for 1 year. That's that's far more than one a week coming on board to do this. And also for making internal development faster. Well, we've vastly increased the number of developers who can actually work on this because they no longer have a C++ requirement. It's people like me. It's the general kind of happy web hackers, web developers who can now work on this core experience. And the way that it's packaged differently, we are able to ship daily. We can push this stuff at any time. We don't need to recompile the binaries across the different platforms. It's completely platform independent. So yeah, we've vastly increased not only our development but our deployment as well. So you can see that with a clear goal, we can measure how successful we are. But essentially, the way you measure success depends entirely on your intent. Finally, I actually took this idea of how you measure success to one of our API teams, and one of the guys he used to work on MooTools. He said, an API is successful if the number of people bitching about an API is less than the number of people independently supporting it. I think this comes from his MooTools days. But that seems a little flippant, but I thought it raised an excellent point of the ecosystem surrounding your API. So in addition to, it's not just documentation. So number one, extensive tutorials. People are copy-paste coders. Essentially, well, not all of them. Humans learn from copying. We've always done it, okay? From when we learn by copying and sometimes failing. It's human nature. Build tutorials, and this is an excellent way of getting them to build things properly, okay? You have the opportunity to guide how they implement your APIs, because a lot of them are going to see that, say, that does roughly what I need, change it a little bit. Number two, encourage self-help. Very, very important. Stack Overflow is an incredibly popular, incredibly successful website, numerous spin-offs, and that exists on the basic principle that developers want to help each other. Okay, so let them. It's going to take a lot of overhead off you if they're able to help themselves. Encourage this. Find the people who are helping and thank them. If they're so engaged with your APIs that they're helping other people use them, to have the official organization say thank you to them, that means a hell of a lot. Resource organization, pretty simple. Your documentation is only good if anyone can find it. Again, miss an awful lot. The first thing you're doing is heading to Stack Overflow instead of the actual organization's website, developer website, you've done something wrong. And be proactive, okay? Find these people. It's a bit like the self-help. Encourage the self-help, but be proactive in gathering the feedback. And if you make a change to your API based on feedback that you've got, push it back through that channel. People love to feel looked after. And you don't do that being this kind of isolated shell. Be proactive. Help these people. Go out into the community. Go to, I know we do a lot of hack day stuff, music hack day stuff. That's incredibly important. Make them feel looked after. So in summary, Basically, building an API is an incredibly awesome thing to do, but it is a lot more than just throwing together a few endpoints. Kind of the businessy side, to get that out of the way, you need to define the intention of your API if you have any way of measuring success. And that's very, very important if you're trying to upsell this idea of creating an API to people further up in the business. Support your developers, okay? They bring users. They bring, like with Moo, they bring customers as well. So support them, help them to bring this additional traffic to your service. Stay in charge, very, very important. It's very tempting to be over-helpful. You have to stay in charge with exactly what your API does. And if you version it, then of course this gives you greater flexibility to do that. And finally, well, not quite finally, stay online. It's pretty obvious, but it is a commitment. There is a great commitment to the resource needed to power an API. And you're only as good as your ecosystem. If nobody's going to use this thing, there was hardly any point doing it in the first place. So a quick bit of further reading, if you're interested. API Evangelist, that's a very good website. It's it sort of talks about it from both sides, like how to help the community and what's good practice when implementing. Programmable Web, they've got a massive index of all sorts of APIs. That's probably one of the websites I've used the most over the years, just finding APIs to do cool stuff with. And they have a number of good articles as well, what makes a good API, what makes a bad API. But if you're really kind of a little bit more hardcore than that, then look up this book, Practical API Design. It's from a kind of Java background, so it's a lot more in-depth than the kind of webby stuff I've been talking about, but definitely worth a read. So thank you very much. Here's some details if you want to come and find me, if you want to come and chat to me. It's been a bit of a kind of whirlwind overview, but if you want to come and find me afterwards, ask some questions, get some help, please do. And of course, the Spotify platform has a Twitter account if you've got any questions you want to ask them directly. Thank you very much.